Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Politics of Paganism. I'm Alex Denley here with Dr. Andrew Jones.
Hello.
So we're on Aristotle now. So last two episodes were on Plato. We went really slowly through the Republic. And the first of the episodes on Plato was really about justice. Mm-hmm. What is justice? And we encountered this kind of initial problem of relative and absolute justice. That even though you can see that there's some standard of justice, there's a form of justice out there, that it's always instantiated in the city in a relative way. And the challenge that when it's instantiated in a relative way, that it always serves the regime, or it always serves the powerful. Mm-hmm. And then we explored in the second episode with Plato the denigration of the regime forms, right? So you have an initial kind of aristocracy, the decline into oligarchy, democracy, and eventually tyranny, where the unity of the city, or you could say the justice and the friendship that holds the city together, shrinks. Mm-hmm. It grows smaller and smaller. It's initially the whole city in this kind of like virtuous aristocracy thing. Then it gets isolated to the wealthy. Then the many get power of the regime, and then finally the one. So now we're talking Aristotle. There's a lot of things, obviously, being a student of Plato and of the Academy, a lot of things very similar. The two we want to focus on, I think, for this time, the concept of the natural slave and how that impacts Aristotle's view of the just city mm-hmm. and view of the best constitution, and also what he means by the mixed constitution or the mixed regime, how you can take from different elements of each of the regimes.
Yeah, that sounds right. Let's do it.
Okay, great. Well, let's start with the natural slaves then.
Yes. This is something that is interesting because a lot of moderns view it as a sort of unfortunate foible of Aristotle, right? That like, oh, listen, look at how brilliant he is, how rational, how we have this sort of proto-democracy notion of all these citizens that are going to have, participate in politics and all this stuff. And there's a slave thing, but that's too bad. And that's just because he's, the ancient world, there were slaves. And
so we can forget that part and take everything else.
Yeah. That actually doesn't work at all, right? I think the natural slaves, there's a reason why he begins the politics with a discussion of slaves and what they are. And I think it's actually essential for the understanding of the entire book, the whole theory. It's hard for me to even know where to begin. But here, let me just try to explain. I'll try to explain essentially what is a natural slave. I'll try to do that, and you can jump in when I miss something. But what Aristotle's arguing is that he uses the analogy basically of the human being as a whole, and he says, okay, the human being has reason and has a body, and the reason has two components to it. It has a deliberative, and then it also has the appetite or the will that obeys the deliberative, and then it has a body. All right, in the body, so you have these different things, and it's a whole. So now the problem he has is he goes from there, and he goes, okay, now man is a political animal, he argues, and so there's a whole. The whole of man is going to be this political thing, the city, rather than being any individual man. All right. So it's not that any individual man is man in of himself. In fact, any individual man, Aristotle says, is either a beast or a god, but not a man. Right. A man is a man as a part of the city. Mm. But the city then, as the city, in order to and this whole thing is rather convoluted, so just bear with me for a second. The city, if man is a political animal, then man's end is a political end, all right? Because ends are what determine what a thing is. So if man's end is the same as Plato has for man's end, so let's say man's end, and basically what Aristotle explains in the Ethics, so that man's end is variously translated as contemplation of the good, virtue, but it's sort of the philosophers. How would I describe it, Alex?
They reach the perfection of man. The philosopher does.
Yeah, the philosopher. But what does it consist of? It consists of a entirely contented and self-sufficient contemplation of the true and the good, right? Right. And so there is no necessity in it. There's no anxiety in it. It's a sort of completion of the intellect, basically. A completion of contemplation or speculation is sort of the end. Well, if that's the end of man, and man is a political animal, you get into a problem, right? Where are we arguing then? And this is the way some moderns want to try to misinterpret Aristotle, I think, that somehow the polity or the political realm is where man, like all the different men, achieve that end.
Right. Yeah.
And no, the answer is no. When Aristotle says that man is a political animal, he's not saying that each individual man achieves the end of man in a polity. What he's saying is the polity is the thing in which the achievement of that end occurs. Do you see what I'm saying? The polity achieves that end. Not the parts of the whole. The whole does. Right? So you have and what that amounts to, and we'll talk about, I'm sure, at length as we go on here, what that amounts to is that the statesman or the ruler, the man at the top, is both the perfectly good man and the perfectly good citizen. And it is at that point that those things coincide. Right? So the whole of the city is ordered towards the production of and the maintenance of man, the perfect man. Okay, so, and that, now it's conceivable that there could be many of those perfect men. It's conceivable even that all the citizens could be that, right? In which case you could conceive of a sort of perfect city in which every citizen is achieving that end. And Aristotle entertains that towards the end, I mean, in places. But the point is that the end that is achieved is a corporate end. Okay, so the body of the city is the thing that does it, not each of the individual parts. The reason why this matters is because then, for the whole discussion of slavery, is that we now have the self-sufficiency of that city. So remember, the philosopher is this sort of self-sufficient mode of being, is an imperative. So it has to exist without struggle, or it has to subsist, the city, right, in itself. And we might think of that as like its body, right? Okay, and then the intellect can operate within that. And that subsistence is what Aristotle, what the argument here that Aristotle's making is that is contingent, or that there's a section of the city. It's actually not properly part of the city, but there's a section of humanity, let's say, that exists for the purpose of providing the material resources for the possibility of the achievement of man's end. So the possibility of the city, the citizens. All right. So the natural slave is the being. I'm hesitant to say man, because Aristotle, he wavers on this. He equivocates, but philosophically, I think we have to basically treat the natural slave as not a man. He's a beast, really.
Right. He says that's the analogy, is as different as man is to beast is the master from the slave. Yeah. If it was going to be according to nature and not just according to law, right?
Right.
But he asserts that they are according to nature.
Yeah, it is according to nature that there are men who lack reason. Right. So if a man has both reason and body, then there are men who lack the deliberative function of reason. They can still have, and again, this is actually somewhat ambiguous in Aristotle. He kind of takes it different ways, but they could still have. What makes them different than a straight beast or a straight animal is they have the ability to participate in reason, meaning to obey reason. They have the ability to obey the commands and to understand the commands. And so they have that makes them a special kind of animal, right? But nevertheless, they lack one of the characteristics of human beings, which is deliberative rationality.
The ruling reason is not present. It's only the obeying reason.
Right, and the body. Right. And so they serve then as property. So this is the same. What Aristotle says is this is the same. This is the same. If you're going to categorize these types of people, you categorize them in the same sort of way that you categorize any instrument, right? So a tool helps one produce things useful. It's useful and it helps you produce things, and machines help you produce things. You know, he talks about the loom and that sort of thing. And the slave is the same sort of thing. And in the same way that a piece of property is an extension of the one who uses it and the extension of the owner, the master, the slave is to be understood as an extension of the master's body, right? So the slave is just an extension of the master's rationality. And the slave participates in that rationality merely instrumentally, purely by obeying.
And there's something else he says that kind of perplexed me, which is that so he asserts that there are these men who only have reason in the obeying sense, and that to be ruled despotically or to be ruled by a master is actually the fulfillment of their nature, right? Like, so you say there are these men that don't have ruling reason, and actually they should be ruled this way in order to fulfill their nature. Whereas there's some type of like common good between master and slave there, which is weird.
That's something that's often confused, right? People are confused because he'll say they have a common interest, right? And people go, see, look at this is like what's good for the slave. And it's like, well, what he actually says is that the interest of the master is the governing interest, and that the interest of the slave is incidental, meaning that the master is concerned about the continued functioning of the slave, right? Which means his existence, his feeding of him, whatever education is required in order for him to be good at his task, right? So the master is incidentally concerned. And then Aristotle says, and there's a certain goodness in just existing, right? That like things want to exist, the slave wants to exist. And so he has, he's participating in the good in his existence, and therefore there's a shared interest. You know, in the same sort of way that there's a shared interest between the soul and the body, say, right? Like, but to speak of the body as having an interest is a curious thing to say, right? It's
right.
It's like we start speaking sort of analogously when we talk about, well, the body's healthy and the soul's healthy. We can start speaking about those sort of things, but the body doesn't have a reason and a will in the same sort of way as the soul does. And so it doesn't have, it's only analogous that we can talk about interests, not unifically.
No, they're not the same. And I wonder if so at the end of book 1, he's arguing with people who think there's just slaves by law, right? So that this is the idea that, well, obviously, if you enslave another people, then it could just be that it's just by law. We had more force, we were superior in virtue and force, and we won against you, and therefore we conceive of you as natural slaves, but real philosophers know this is just law and constructed. And when he goes through the slaves by nature, it's to solve a lot of those problems that exist when you have slaves just by law, because it's a kind of revolutionary thing, or like when Plato's describing the pure unity in the Republic or the just city, and the idea that you keep war on the outside, there's no real slaves, they're all participating. Aristotle doesn't think that's going to work in practice, and so there has to be slavery, a kind of natural slavery, in order for the city to really exist, right?
Right. So what we saw with Plato was that he wanted unity. He was after unity within the city. And after Glaucon's intervention, we said, okay, if we're going to have unity in the city, but we're going to have luxuries and leisure, which is prerequisite for philosophy, I suppose, right? Then we are going to have war, but we'll have war outside the city. The guardians will be oriented as friends inside, enemies outside. Okay, and we'll extract surplus from those who are outside the city. But Aristotle is obsessed with self-sufficiency. He desperately wants this, and that's my point is that is not a self-sufficient entity, Plato's, right?
Oh, right, yeah,
right.
Yeah.
It is going out to extract from another entity, for other entities.
So it's dependent on the extraction from the outside.
Whereas Aristotle wants that to become inside the polity, right? So we're going to move the population that we are extracting surplus from from outside the city into the city. And now we have a problem. Now we're basically at war with sections of your own population, right, in order to extract from them. And that's exactly right? That you are at war with the slaves. I mean, Aristotle talks about this quite frequently in the text, and he talks about the way that acquiring slaves, for example, is a mode of hunting and warfare, right? Where you hunt for men, and what you're doing is there's a process by which what Aristotle says is a man who is capable of becoming the property of another does. Okay, so basically the point is that through a process of war, continuous sort of conflict of people attempting to exploit other people, the ones who literally war outside the city, but then also a form of war inside, the ones who submit to the rule of another rather than die, basically,
by suicide,
but that's what reveals them to be the natural slave.
Is the moment in which they...
So you either win the contest, right? The hunting contest, the war contest, or you die if you're a free man, right? A free man will not accept servility. A free man shows himself to be free by refusing the compromise, which is slavery, right? He'll never do it. Mm-hmm. Whereas the natural slave reveals himself to be a natural slave because it's possible for him to become a slave.
Because he submits, right? So you have, even in the Odyssey, Odysseus, after his adventures, has like 50 to 100 slaves, and Homer intends that as showing his glory and his virtuous warrior element, is to say, well, he went out and hunted that many slaves and enslaved them, and so there's an element going back in that even way before Aristotle in the classical period of slave hunting and proving your merit as a warrior and proving your accomplishments and your glory. But now, like you're saying with the difference with Plato and Aristotle here, that type of slave hunting now becomes internal to the self-sufficiency of the city, or in a sense, the maintenance of the enslaving mechanism is inside. Like we have to make sure.
Right, and this is important because this goes to the distinction you were just making about natural slaves and slaves by law. Right, so chattel slavery, slaves who are bought and sold legally with contracts and all that kind of thing. I think if I'm reading Aristotle correctly, the vast majority of those people are also slaves by nature, because otherwise they wouldn't consent to being slaves by law. Okay, so I think there's a couple places where he says there might be some exceptions, but generally speaking, that is the case. But they're not the only slaves, is the point. Right, so the servile people of the city are not merely those who are slaves by law, so what we think of as legal slavery, but they're also the ones who have become instrumental to the achievement of the city's end. Right, which so they have lost the deliberative function and have become merely participating in the reason of another. And are therefore tools of that other in the achievement of his ends. And this expands to include in various parts of the text, right? Because he's talking about various compromises and different things at different places. All farmers, all tradesmen, all craftsmen, all mechanics.
Yeah, even women, I think maybe the merchant class.
The merchant class.
He does distinguish women aren't a part of it.
Women are... Yeah, sometimes one, sometimes the other. Children, sort of in different contexts. Right. But basically, what we're seeing is that what he's doing is he's saying, the way I'm going to make the city a thing that achieves the end of man is I'm going to have citizens who are when Aristotle now talks about the city doing this or doing that, he's now talking about the citizens. Right? He's no longer talking about the great mass of people who are making the citizens' way of life possible. Those are slaves, right? They're not necessarily legal slaves. They could be natural slaves. They're all the tradesmen and the craftsmen and all the people who are the mechanics who are building everything. And those people are not participating in the governing of the regime and not participating in the good life that the regime makes possible other than in the way in which a slave participates in the good of his master, which we just said is not
instrumental,
which is not. It's actually a different in kind, not in quantity. It's not like he just has less happiness. Right? I mean, Aristotle says that a slave cannot be happy in the sense of what he means by happiness, which is the achievement of the human end.
Yeah, because he's excluded from the city. It's an instrumental type of relationship.
So the way in which you get a self-sufficient city is by limiting the number of citizens, and then expand, and then treating all the other people who are a part of it as property. So now you can say, what's a city? Well, a city is the citizens and its property. That's a city. So can I have a self-sufficient city? Yeah, because I have the citizens and their property, which includes, who knows how
whatever population
of slaves or serfs that are underneath them, right? That are their property, that aren't counted as citizens and aren't considered in any of the rest of the discussions of the politics, right? So when you get these moderns that now want to talk about mixed forms of constitutions and democracies and representatives and all this, as if we didn't move from the very first move is to reduce that citizen class to that which is, and then the whole major problem of the book is how is it that citizen class can achieve enough strength and unity in order to achieve the human end at some level, and in the necessity of one of the necessary aspects of achieving that end is holding all those slaves in subjugation.
Yeah.
Right.
And they all have an interest in that. Like all the classes
all the classes do. So it's there's you see what I'm trying to get at is right from the very beginning. This is a move that I think is mythical on Aristotle's part. And what I mean by that is that he's asserting to be nature what is in fact a convention. Right?
Even in the idea that it reveals itself historically through experience, through you go hunt the slaves, they don't kill themselves, and they are willing to be enslaved. How does that equal a natural claim, right? Or how does that equal a philosophical one? How do you make the distinction in men kind of post-fact like that? And therefore, it has a kind of ideological function.
It definitely has. There's several philosophical problems, I think. You pointed that one out. The similar is why do you prioritize the ultimate compromise, which is I choose life instead of death, and not any number of other compromises that are made throughout the entire text? I mean, throughout the entire text, you have negotiations of power, you have compromises being made, you have people surrendering certain interests here in order to gain interests there. And why is not every one of those any sort of compromise that where you're not just satisfying your own reason and your own appetite, that any of those compromises wouldn't be a form of civility? Or it's like, well, they are. I think within the rationality of, or the logic of the system, they are forms of servility, which means that slavery is not you're either a slave or you're not, but rather there's a continuum or degrees of slavery, degrees of liberty, right? And then which I think is philosophically defensible, and I think that actually Aristotle, when we get into like the practicality of the regimes, I think he starts making arguments that basically lead in that direction, right? That different classes are instrumentalizing the other classes, right? Which is to treat them as slaves, even if those other classes don't realize they're slaves, right? So as a part of the sort of tactic of rule, but there he won't talk. He doesn't invoke natural slavery there. He invokes it in this to refer to this subclass, right, as a sort of hard line, right? There are two right off the bat. There are two types, right, and that's mythical. That feels like
mixture of the elements.
That feels like the metals, Plato's metals, right? That we will tell this story, and in this story, nature will have sorted us into two categories, right?
Yeah, you're really the iron. Like, really, we defeated you, and you didn't kill yourself. You're iron. You're a natural slave. It's
because it's not that he's wrong about the psychology here is very interesting, right? There is no doubt the case that there are people who are weaker, who are more prone to submission. There are more spirited people who are more prone to fight it out to the end. There are people who are more deliberative and people who are more passive. There are people, all of that is true, right? So I'm not trying to make any sort of even vaguely egalitarian argument here, right? Like difference, including in what we might think of as a sort of master-slave or ruler-ruled dichotomy is present throughout the human population. That's clearly the case. What I think is there's a mythical component here is this sorting of the two types and then the positing of an unbridgeable gap between them, right? That like they're not the same species.
Yeah. And, his historical reference that he goes to is, you can enslave those who have reason but are not spirited, but you can enslave the peoples who are spirited without reason. Or just spirited. So the barbarians to the north are spirited but lack the reasoning, and so you can't enslave them. But the Persian and Eastern, they have all this intelligence and they're less spirited, and so that's the reason why they have more despotic empire structures in the East.
Yeah, because they're servile,
and
but reasonable.
He'll say that the Greek, situated between those two with spirit and intelligence, has the ability to rule all of them. And it's like, okay, well, that's just a mythical history you're providing me here,
right?
To support this.
So there's a certain, what we're getting at here is there's a certain justification for the way of life that he's now going to defend. Do you see? Like Aristotle is now going to argue philosophically in favor of the sort of regime that he favors, right? And I think, and that's not to say it's not brilliant, right? It could be a really brilliant argument and even be full of amazing insights about how politics works, right? How power works. Brilliant, very brilliant analysis, very often. But nevertheless, agenda driven, right? And we have to be very, very clear about that. Like the sort of modern commentators who are obsessed with the idea of the self-sufficient city and the perfect community, and people will talk about this kind of stuff. Sure. And it's like, that's just not relevant here, right? There is absolutely no reason why Aristotle's beginning moves in this about the self-sufficient city couldn't be a city of, say, 1,000 citizens and 20 million slaves. There's no reason why it can't be an empire, except for the sheer impracticality of it, right? So like all the pragmatic and like, well, how do we do this? We have to play this faction over that faction. We get stretched too thin. We can't, like all the pragmatic sciences of power that fill most of the text are basically explaining why that's not practical, right? Or one of the things you can take away from it is that's not practical. But philosophically speaking, it's no less self-sufficient or perfect or whatever, right? I mean, like if you could dominate the entirety of the population and be a little packet of aristocratic citizens, okay.
It still works, yeah. I just want to restate that point. I think it's really important because when he's talking about what is the size of this regime, in the later books, he brings it back in book 4, what size can we allow? Like, we're not talking about the mass of slaves. We're talking about the citizens. And there's an importance to what size of citizens is able to be ordered, right? And because he distinguishes that there's two orders of rule, there is the despotic rule and then the statesmanship rule. When he's talking about the size of rule, it's talking about the statesmanship. What amount of citizens can the statesman order? But presumably, if you could have a despotic relationship with any number of size of potential slaves.
Well, yeah,
right?
You're just richer.
Yeah, you got more.
It's just more property. I mean, your self-sufficient city, whatever the heck that means, right? I mean, it's so boring. It's such a boring concept. I mean, I find the whole notion that somehow what we're after is some sort of like self-sufficient perfection or something to just be a really boring philosophical
well, I think what you're
notion.
I think what you're arguing here is it's not it's not actually achievable even on its own terms, right? Because the slaves themselves are not part of the city, and so the city is dependent on the slaves to have all their own self-sufficiency.
Well, the only way you do it is with a sophistic. What's the word? Sophistic move, linguistic move, which is just define the slaves as property.
Oh, right. And then the city's self-sufficient.
And then the city's self-sufficient because its property is self. It's just it's an uninteresting, unphilosophical concept. I mean, it's not. I'm bored by it. I don't.
By self-sufficient. Okay.
The whole concept of self-sufficient.
Maybe let me restate a few things of where we're at. So, this is mainly like initially the book 1, natural slaves, the ideological claim going on. The problem, the sidestepping of the unity problem by a incorporation of natural slaves into the regime, right? With Plato, the unity problem where you have to have the war outside. But I think we're seeing here that you're bringing the war internal to the city because now there's a master and slave relationship going on.
But you're getting out of calling it war because you're treating it as an aspect of justice.
That they're ruled in this way.
They're ruled in this way by nature, which is the myth that justifies this most basic aspect of the regime. So all the regimes that follow are going to be built upon this first move.
Right. And that is just so enormous to know what he's talking about, right?
Right.
You can't forget that this is have it in your mental picture of what's going on here, the structural element. And then when he's describing, and this is where we're going to go to, when he's describing the different regime forms then, he is talking about that limited number of citizens over a slave population, and then how best to sort the many, the few, the one in that scenario. And so, in book 2, it's basically him surveying the different constitutions that are out there, right? It's Plato's laws and the Republic, and he disagrees with certain things. He looks at the Spartan constitution. He looks at the Carthaginian and the Cretan constitutions, and he's looking for the things they do well, the things they don't do so well. And then book 3, we're on to the citizen, and then we're on to the regime forms again. And but importantly here, and maybe we have more to say on the natural slaves and the city, but that's all of that discussion was preceded by this.
Yes,
and
that's right.
The structure, we have to understand that's still there.
Yeah, and so there's two things that are happening in the beginning. Okay, I think the natural slave discussion is just essential because it'll actually come up not only explicitly over and over again, but when we start talking about the different regime forms or the different prudential plays a statesman can make, we'll have to introduce natural slavery. We'll have to recognize natural slavery at play again. Only now we're not going to call it slavery. Okay, so we're going to call because that's not a part of the mythos that makes the city work, right? So we're going to call it. We're going to have different classes that are instrumentalizing each other, but we're going to talk about that as within the citizens. Okay, and it's important philosophically for us to not think that we can say, okay, we're going to have the natural slave versus non-natural freeman distinction, and now we're going to go talk about freemen and not reintroduce the distinction there. What I mean is now I've got a population of citizens, and now that is the population that is seeking ends and that have different interests and different objectives and different ends. And so aren't I now in a situation that was basically the same as when I looked at the whole of the population? And so now I'm in a situation where there are going to be some people who come to dominate other people. There's going to be some people who manipulate other people, some people who are going to submit rather than fight it out. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to have within the citizens more servile and less servile people. And then, and so it just sort of continues all the way through, right? And we have to, so that we don't want, it's not merely that we want to remember at the beginning that we did this. We need to remember that we need to remember to not fall prey to the mythical version of it, and allow that idea of basically exploitation to run all the way through.
Could I maybe try to say it simply, because it hit me when he was saying Aristotle, in I think book 7, was saying the essence of freedom is to rule and to be ruled in turn. Now, the essence of the slave is to be ruled. But could we imagine the highest man being only rule? So he only rules, right?
Yes.
Like he's not ruled by anyone.
Right.
So then we're looking at the city. Who gets ruled more?
Exactly.
It's kind of like, so who's closer to the slaves?
Who's closer to the slave?
And who's closer to the one who only rules? And so in that scenario, it's like, okay, well, there's freedom, but already we've distinguished levels of freedom where the people who are just above the slaves, but they have the lowest place. Maybe they're not, he'll say it's divided between the poor and the wealthy mainly. They're like the lowest level of the poor who are still citizens. They're being ruled far more than they're ruling, and they're far closer to the slaves. So that's the problem.
Yeah,
what
ends up happening, I think, maybe I'm missing something here, but what I think happens is that in order to be consistent, what you have to see is that what changes when you start talking about the citizens is that the more powerful citizens or interactions with the weaker citizens, there are more goods of the weaker citizen that are incidental to the interests of the more powerful citizens. So in the for the slave, those goods are very minimal. He has to eat, he has to stay alive, relatively be healthy, know what he needs to do his little task or whatever. But if I'm now an aristocrat, I'm within a citizen body, and I need a hoplite army of citizen soldiers, right, in order to maintain my self-sufficient way of life.
Sure.
Right? Now the good of those people who I'm instrumentalizing as my warrior class in order to provide me with that, it includes more than just food and survival. Now there's other goods. They need certain virtues. They need certain education. They need to have certain personal beliefs about their own dignity. They need to have certain, now the goods that are incidental to my good are expanded. And so now I rule them differently. So I don't, and this is, I think, the distinction, right? I don't rule them as property like an animal. I'm still treating them as instruments, but now I'm treating them as instruments for whom their own rationality is a part of their instrumentality for me. Like I want them to be able to think.
I want them to be educated.
I want them to have virtues, to have courage, to have loyalty, to have fortitude, to have, and that becomes, and therefore I'm ruling free men. But again, it's a sliding scale. You see, right? And that's when he talks about all the different regime forms. You can see the sliding scale in play, right?
Yes, and that's why he'll say education is such an important thing, like the most important thing for a statesman in that type of way. It's basically the making possible the ability to rule free men by educating them into the things you need, or making them conform to that power above, right? There's an importance to kind of disciplining and educating. The statesman is concerned with all of that to actually instrumentalize their reason,
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, we're talking about it somewhat like it's nefarious, but it's really, from Aristotle's point of view, not nefarious, because what he's getting at is that fulfillment of human nature itself, which is the perfect man, the perfect philosopher, the perfect contemplative soul, that in order for that to be achieved, there are these lower ranks within the city of citizens who are being elevated into a higher level participation in that as an aspect of making it possible, right? As achieving that telos. Mm-hmm. So it's like the mass of citizens that are the sort of middle classes, the mass of citizens, right? And it's important that we understand what he's talking about there. He's not talking about middle class like merchants or something. He's talking about basically what we would think of more as like the gentry, right? Like the middle class of citizen warriors. It's a aspect of the police, right? Military state,
not suburb bombs.
Yeah. So you have that their effectiveness in making the telos of man possible is a higher level participation in that end. Right? And so if the slave is the one who participates as best he can just by living, the next levels are participating at a higher level, and then above him, the aristocrats or the notables are participating at an even higher level, and then the man at the top, right? The statesman himself, who is the architect of the whole thing, and who is the one in whom, like I said earlier, in whom being a good man and being a good citizen actually coincide. Because for those other categories of citizens, that's not so, right? To be a good sort of middling citizen is not the same as being a good man one-to-one. It's to share certain traits with good man, full stop. But it's like we're back to the kind of distinction between the relative and the absolute here, right? That there's a sort of relative justice for the different classes and the different groupings of people, and their achievement to be a just man in their place is a sort of good, but it's not the good.
Yes, it's not the statesman. His ability to reach full virtue. He's instrumentalizing the rest
thing.
of the rest of the city in that type of way. Okay, so the statesman at the top, and this is important. We were discussing, the idea of the statesmanship is this architectonic science, or
right.
Politics is an architectonic science. And then the question, so that it's this imminent practical science where you're orienting all these things, but the question you raised was, well, who practices the architectonic science?
Right. Yeah, because here's the problem. Is like you look at the regime forms, the way it's laid out in the politics, and it's like, well, okay, you have oligarchies and you have democracies, basically, right? And there's variations within the two, but basically, and there's like good, relatively better and relatively worse forms, and we might call them aristocracies or whatever. But basically, we have the two forms. And you would want to say, well, in an oligarchy, the oligarchs rule, and in a democracy, the people rule, right? And it's like, well, that's interesting. Okay, that's like on the face of it true, but the kind of context or the assumption of the whole book is that there's some legislator who is able to play the oligarchic against the democratic, to see the values of all of the oligarchic impulses, but then the dangers of them, and then see the democratic, and then put them together and do. It doesn't seem to be the case that the oligarchs are actually the rulers. It's right that
in Aristotle's Just City here when he's
the whole premise of the whole book.
Okay, right.
Right. The premise of the whole book is like. Is like, if you want your regime to survive, then you have to do it. The premise of the whole book is that there's some legislator, and he talks about the legislator from time to time, mentions him, that is somehow constructing the city out of these parts, and the nature of the people. And so this is like you can see this as sort of a handbook where he's saying, look, if the end of man is to be achieved, then we have to construct these cities, because man is a political animal. We have to a polity that goes to this end. And there's a science to that, and an art, right? The city is ultimately an artifact. It's ultimately, and that's the highest science, because it's the architectonic one. It's the one that actually orders man towards his end, is the political science. But the condition of the people, so if the people are the types of people for whom democratic stuff works, or the types of people for whom oligarchic stuff works, then this architectonic legislator, whoever he is, uses those things. And so we get oligarchies, right? And so it's very...
So he's orienting each of those. He's taking elements of the oligarchic to favor the few. He's taking elements of the democratic to favor the many. But again, they're, like you were saying, they're sorted into, the statesman himself, the notables, the hoplite,
mass. Sometimes he calls them, but I think
the mass,
the
warriors.
They're the warriors. Yeah, the citizen warriors, hoplite armies. Yeah.
Yeah, and he brings up, this is one of those, like, it might just be a commonplace, but he's bringing up Sparta and Athens over and over again in comparing well, Sparta didn't do this, and therefore their women became luxurious, and then they couldn't manage their slaves right. And Athens over here was too democratic, and they weren't oligarchic enough, and they weren't able to do this or that. And just thinking about, well, if we're imagining this, you have this large slave population, you have the masses, and you take elements of the democratic to make them think that they're ruling themselves, but they form the major part of your military. And then the notables are a kind of virtuous elite, and so they're set above everyone. And then within that is the real legislator, the real political artist, the statesman, something like that.
This is very interesting, right? Because this is where I think Aristotle here is just like the most interesting. It is, and it's subtle. I think maybe it can be overlooked, but that middle class, that root, the army, all right. What he says is that the best form, the best kind of regime, like this kind of constitutional regime or polity, depending on the translation. I think polity is probably the best, but is one in which they, like you said, they believe themselves to be equals with what we're calling the notables.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And what he says is that if they have participation, they have the ability to participate in the offices of rule, and they feel that they're valued as participants in it, that for the most part they won't want to, right? Like for the most part, because they're not very wealthy, they'll be more concerned about their affairs, and they will not seek to rule, and they'll be content with understanding these notables to basically be the same as them, the same citizens as them, but not really, right? Like so their justice, which is because they're the mass, they're and this is a complicated discussion, but their sense of justice emphasizes the equality aspect of justice, and so you have to, as the ruler, you have to appease that and say we're all equals. All right, we're all the same. And so they believe that to be so. Okay, and then they can be contented by kind of backing away then from the high affairs. All right, then so they think the notables are the same as them. Now the notables then can be content because their justice emphasizes superiority. Their sense of justice is the unequal side of justice. Remember, justice is rendering the unequal equal. So it's this like proportionate ordering of things that are unequal to each other, right? So they emphasize the superiority side of the concept of justice, and they're contented because they're receiving all the honors, because they're the ones, they don't see lesser people receiving honors, which is what frustrates them, right? So because they're the ones who are actually ruling, they can be contented. All right. Now they think, just like how the middling class thinks those notables are just one of them, I think this is, I'm somewhat extrapolating here, but I think this is the way this works. They believe the statesman to be one of them. Do you see? Okay, so they within their mode of justice, they think they're the deliberative force. They're the ones that taught. In a sense, they are the deliberative apparatus. But the ultimate lawgiver is among them, but is actually instrumentalizing them. But they don't, just as the same sort of way that the middle class doesn't perceive that about the notables don't perceive that about the statesmen. And this, and the place where this is most visible is when Aristotle, most obvious is when Aristotle's talking about the tyrant and what the tyrant ought to do, right? If one finds himself in tyranny. Go to that. And the gist of the argument is that he ought to make himself appear to be one of the aristocracy, right? To make himself appear to be their equal.
For people who want to find it, it's around 13, 14, that area where he talks about one mode of preservation for tyrannies then is of this sort. And he goes through, the editor for this book has 34 points of how you can be a tyrant. You can go from being a tyrant to appearing like you're a king, or kind of hiding among the aristocracy. One of kind of that preserve your regime, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're operating in a different mode, right? At a higher level. And so you can engage within the structures and the constitutional form of that which is lower than you. Yes. But then you're instrumentalizing that into a higher objective, right? And so you can the best way to be a tyrant is actually to stop being one, right? I mean, like,
yeah. That's where he ends up. He said if you follow this program here, you can be half decent. Not only do you start to rule as a monarch, but you start to habituate yourself into monarchical type rule, right? So you become aware that the good of these notables is conducive to your own good. The good of the middle classes is conducive to your own good. And so you are working within their senses of justice in order to maximize your own achievement of the good, right? Now that becomes indistinguishable. I think Aristotle's point is if you really figure this out, guys, that becomes indistinguishable from the rule of a king, right? Like that is in fact the most effective rule, meaning a king is one whose rule is ordered to the good of those underneath him rather than to his own good. Because what's discovered is that the good of the whole is what's conducive to the good of the guy at the top. Mm-hmm. But you have to remember, we've already said the good of the whole is not the same all the way through. The slave's good is just existence. We're not talking about like freeing the slaves and giving them rights. Yeah.
Or anything like that. That's like
there's an element here, just thinking about the Strauss and Alexander Kojève debate on tyranny. There's an element here of like Plato went and visited Dionysius of Syracuse, and he was friends with Dion. And when he went there, Dionysius was a tyrant, and so he was invited as a foreign guest, and it was to give this philosophical wisdom to the tyrant. Plato didn't want to go initially, but then he went and he realized it was terrible, obviously, and he tried to tell the tyrant this, change these things. He wouldn't do it. Dion was killed for rebellion, and then Plato tried to leave, and Dionysius wouldn't let him leave, and eventually he was able to go. But with Strauss and Kojève in the book On Tyranny, and they're going back and forth, but the idea that the philosopher could utilize the tyrannical power, or basically when you're the tyrant, you have this kind of like ultimate artistry of the city. Like you think of the tyranny of the 30 with Critias, where he exiles all these people, he wipes the city clean, as Socrates will say, and then recreates it. That what if you became the tyrant, you got tyrannical power, but then you walked back all the tyrannical appearances. Like you walked back the whole everyone's my slave. You stop spending all the common funds. You
start spreading the spoils among the notables. You start
inviting
people into your circle. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You don't have this warfare going on with your everyone's an enemy and everyone wants to kill you. And then could you get to the point where you're half decent and only half vicious as he ends it here? And in that way, could the philosopher be there to restructure the Constitution? Something like that. I don't know. It's something.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that there's a sort of cynical read that I guess I'm partial to, which is like when Aristotle talks about the potential for a virtuous city, and he talks about the good that's possible at all the different levels, and that's all possible. Right, like, and any given regime is sort of a mixture of exploitation at every level and the seeking of the good at every level. And there's this kind of like the seeking of the good for the sake of exploitation that comes into play, like we've talked about. But, Aristotle does something different than Plato here. And bear with me. Aristotle wants to see that the forms. So for like Plato, kingship and tyranny are the furthest away from each other.
Yes.
And quite literally, like you start out with the decline of the regimes with kingship, and then you end with tyranny. Those are the furthest away from each other in time, right? Like, whereas Aristotle starts at the closest, right? And same with aristocracy and oligarchy, and the reason why I think what's going on there is that because of what we were talking about here, that the form becomes indistinguishable or can become indistinguishable to where it's like you just kind of flip between one or the other depending on intention.
Perspective?
Intention.
Oh, okay.
So it's like the perfect tyrant. The perfect tyrant is indistinguishable from the perfect king because that's the ultimate form of rule.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, well, what's the difference? His intention. Is his intention the good of the whole, or is his intention his good of himself? And so there's and you have so let's look at like this extends all the way down through. So look at the aristocrats. If you have, what's the strength of these notables? Their conviction in honor, the belief in honor, the desire for honor. Okay, that gives them a sense of justice that prizes superiority, and so it has them achieve excellence or tries to achieve excellence. But what if we already said that there's the statesman is among them and is pretending to be one of them? Pretending to operate within the same framework of justice that they are operating in order to achieve his own power. All right, that's his own designs for the city. Well, what if he's not alone faking it? What if they're all faking it?
Yeah.
Right? What if the whole class is a class of just that, and this is entertained in the Republic, this possibility, right? That the whole thing is because there's this law that governs this class, it's in all of our advantages to enforce it. As long as we're not the most powerful one, as long as we feel like we're in it, we're going to enforce it. This law that governs the power of the group we're a part of. And so we're going to dish out justice or honor and dishonor in such a way that maintains it. But that's all opportunistic on our part and we don't believe it. Well, at what point is that indistinguishable from an aristocracy that actually believes it? Right? Like indistinguishable from, say, the class below them. But they're actually very different. One of which, if they are actually honor-based and they're actually therefore moving deeper into virtue, then the trajectory of the city is towards the perfect city. Whereas if they're actually faking it, if it's actually instrumental all the way down, then the trajectory is towards the more perfect tyranny.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
But the overlap is 1-to-1.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
You see, so the aristocracy and the oligarchy are. I think
splits through it.
I think that's what Aristotle's getting at. Okay. So you. That wasn't clear, was it?
No. I mean, it's complicated.
It's very complicated.
Well, is it? What my question then is? Is it a problem of how would you know? Like that's the constant thing I always come back to. It's kind of Plato's question. Like, how would you know? Like this tyrant who becomes the half vicious, half virtuous guy. Mm-hmm. How would you still judge him, whether he's tyrant or king? Is it a problem of perception? Like, do you have to be outside the regime? That was kind of the Plato thing. And same with aristocracy and oligarchy. It's like, okay, well, there's all these virtuous elite. Are they virtuous? Like, are they acting for my good? Are they how internal to them? Do they also? It's almost as if they believe they're oligarchs, they're tending towards oligarchy. Like if they believe they're aristocracy and they believe they're acting for the good of the citizens, it's almost like they're headed in the right direction, right? Like I just have this problem. Like I don't know how to solve the problem of perception here.
Yeah, I think that.
Is there an objective?
I think that's because you can't solve it. I think that's because the only one who's in a position to do it, to see it, is this perfect statesman. Right, this perfect philosopher-statesman who sees the good itself, whose virtue is virtue itself, whose justice is justice itself, who has, therefore, the architectonic vision, right? Like he's in a position to judge all these things. Everyone else is in it, right? And so only that person is in that position. But the irony is that it doesn't matter where you are in the city, you think you're that person. I mean, like what I mean is like, that part of what constitutes and this is, he talks about this, right? Like what's part of what constitutes the sense of justice that animates the oligarchic class. What makes that is that that's actually their sense of justice, right? Like it's something like we talked about with Plato. It's like they're not aware that their sense of justice is relative. Otherwise, it wouldn't be their sense of justice. It is their sense of justice. So it's like it is what they believe justice to be. Well, that belief is as pure as the belief of the philosopher, right?
Sure.
Okay, so when my point would be, and this is where it's like not only can you not know so let's say you're in the aristocracy and you think of yourself as the architect of this whole thing, and you're in there manipulating it and trying to work within the rules of the aristocracy and of the warrior class beneath you to kind of build this perfect city and all this. And you believe that you're the one in the position to do that. Well, it's the case that all the guys around you think that too.
Yeah, right.
Right? Like, and so they
they all think they're
even though when one of you may actually be the one who's in charge, but it part of being in charge is sort of being it's not perceptible that you are.
Yeah, it's the more hidden the power type.
Yeah,
of,
so it's sort of
here.
this kind of trap, or a conundrum, I guess.
Yeah, it kind of reminds of the Leviathan image, right? Like even the I know that might be going too far. But,
no, I think it is.
But I mean, the statesman at the top, does he even, and maybe we could introduce like Hegel's master-slave dialectic to some degree, because you can see that there's a problem here, because even it's not as though you can instrumentalize the other without any fear and with total submission, like every single time. There is in each of the ruling relationship, there is also the potential for the disobedience, the breaking of the relation, the breaking of the despotic.
Right.
And of course, even internal to the city, there is the breaking apart of what if the class views the class above them as actually destroying them, and so. And in the Hegel's master-slave dialectic, that the master is enslaved to the slaving mechanism, and is actually more a slave of his slave than the slave is of the master. And there's this weird, it's almost as if Aristotle's trying to, in the same way that Plato's trying to solve it, if I could articulate it, you're trying to reach the point where the master-slave, where it only benefits the master, but he's enslaved to the slave. He's trying to reach the point at which they both can achieve happiness, like the fulfillment of their ends in the different ways they're sorted, which to me is just what Plato's saying again. Right, in Plato's Just City, it's every class and the different elements, they reach their perfection as their particular class. So what if we could take all these elements within the citizenship of oligarchy, of the people and the masses, of the rule of the philosophers and the statesmen and the one, and then bring that to perfect happiness or a completedness of the whole?
Yeah, I mean, Aristotle entertains this, doesn't he? I mean, where he talks about, okay, the problem would be so he at a practical level, he says that the mixed regime, or the polity, where you have a large middle class, you have notables. We've already kind of gone. This is the best we can get to some sort of just regime. But then he says, but in the perfect regime, all right. He then spells out where he maintains the same basic structure, but it's going to be the same people in the different roles, but in different stages of their life. So we have the situation, right, when we have the mixed regime in a practical sense, where we go, okay, but the notables are really instrumentalizing the middle people. The middle people are obviously instrumentalizing the slaves, and then the statesman inside is instrumentalizing the whole thing. Okay, and so there's levels of corruption and exploitation going on. But what if we imagined a sort of perfect regime? And it goes, well, where the ruled, all the functions still have to occur. The rule and the ruled have to, or the people have to actually be both ruled and rule, right? and all of them have to achieve the end, the sort of perfect end. All right. Well, this is quite the tall order, and it seems like the best we get to is when he talks about, okay, we could imagine a regime where the young men are the warriors, but even more than that, there's a passage in there it's a very minor passage, but I think it carries a lot of weight because he says something like, it wouldn't even be ignoble. It wouldn't be disgraceful for them to do the kind of work that the servile classes do, because they would be doing it with the intention, with a higher level intention, not the intention that the slaves have, but rather than the intention of the ultimate end, or fulfilling as a participation towards that. And so he imagines the possibility that the younger men not only are training for war, but are also doing work. It seems like they're allowed to do work, right? Because remember, a mark of the upper classes is of leisure.
Yes.
And then and that's the part of reason that is the appetite, right? Like the action part, the where you're not deliberative, but you're obeying reason. And then as they get older and then into middle age, they'll become the deliberative part of the city. So they'll be the part that makes decisions and is rational. That part of the rationality of the body, the corporate body, which is the city. And then when they get older, he says, they'll become the priests. And this is very significant, obviously, because we were talking about the statesman, like the guy who's sort of hidden, or the one who is really the real legislator, and that's a divine office, right? And so it's the priests who are interpreting the will of God, who are the old men. And so you could, in that kind of a scenario, you could see he's saying, look, the same people who are the guys in the middle are the people who are the guys at the top, but just in a different stage in their life.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So everyone moves through this ascending hierarchy and achieves perfection. All right. And that's sort of his like entertaining of what it might be like to have the perfect regime.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right. Well, that's not that different than what Plato says, actually, about the guardians, right? I mean, he has the same sort of thing where the young men go down and serve as the warriors and then are brought back out of the cave again to be elevated in philosophy, and then are brought back down, and then eventually they're made gods, right? I mean, Plato says a similar thing.
So if it was perfectly just, or if everyone was, if we're imagining the perfect city, the different classes would just be the sorting of age.
By age. You're
young, so you go fight the wars.
Well, and this matches with his whole discussion of the family. I mean, this is curious because basically what he's saying is the city becomes a family, which is something that in the beginning he seems to not want to do. Right? In the beginning of the politics, he's really kind of animate that the family,
the household and the city are
different things. But now we have and towards the end of the politics, when he reintroduces this idea, you have the different forms of rule. So you think about when he talks about the family, and he says there's different forms of rule within the family. There's the marital, the husband and the wife, right? Which is aristocratic or statesmanship, like where they're equals, right? Then you have the rule, the paternal, the father over the son, and then the master over the slave. That corresponds in the mixed regime to the notables, which is like the married life, the rule of the notables over the mass, which is the paternal, and then the rule of the mass over the slaves, right? So you have the same form of rule, and what distinguishes the rule of the father over his wife and his children is its rule over free people. And so in the mixed regime, that's now the citizen class, right? And you have the different levels. You have the children who are the warriors. You have the equals who are deliberative. Women have a deliberative function, but no authority, is what he says, right? And then who's above that? Well, the father, right, is above the whole thing. And so again,
it looks like the household.
It's the family. It's the perfect regime then again resembles the family.
Yeah. Are we going back to Plato then? You know,
Yes.
It's almost like you're distinguishing scientifically here and there, and then when you're imagining the perfect again, it's back to the totally unified, perfect, unified city. But okay, maybe we could restate a few things, and then perhaps the later part on happiness and the final. We're reaching the philosopher. So the natural slave, the problem that introduces. The different, basically the mixed constitution as taking elements from each of the different democracy, oligarchy, tyranny, finding ways to basically combine that and get rid of some of the excesses. And then also importantly, like you were saying, the differences in age and how those play with the city. And then, maybe we could talk about the last few chapters on happiness and the ultimate end and where the citizen and the good man meet.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Should we save that for the next one?
Yeah, maybe so. I know we've covered a ton here.
That's pretty, and I have a feeling we have to go back through and go through some of this again, because you've brought up a couple points that I feel like we didn't cover well. That we haven't covered well, like the idea of the slavery, the slavery of the master. Right, that the master is actually enslaved. Yeah, this is a really important, I think, a really important idea, especially when we've been trying at some level here to engage with the Nietzscheans, right? Because it seems like in what we're talking about here that there's a sort of, yeah, great, I want to be the master. I can see how I'm the man who runs the whole thing, and I'm the one who is architectonic, and I'm the smasher of tablets and all that sort of Zarathustra stuff. And it's like, but the deeper point is that the power, Aristotle's understanding of how power, it's like, how does that statesman actually gain and maintain power? Well, he has to lower himself down into the law of the aristocracy and live according to it, right? He has to serve it. Now he's trying to manipulate it, but he's trying to manipulate it within a law that he didn't make. And then that then only works because they're doing the same thing with the warrior class that's even lower. Do you see what I'm saying? And so you have masks, people wearing masks, and it's masks, a mask and then a mask on top of the mask. And but is there anything more servile is the point than that? Like, in order to get my bit, I have to how is that different than the slave who obeys the law of the master to get his end? He wants his dinner, so he obeys the law of the master. I want my end. I'm towards the top, so I'm obeying the law of the aristocracy. It's like, well, that is a debasing, right? That is a lowering of yourself into
the conformity
into the law in order to get something, right? Well, that's servility. So you can see where but to break out of that entirely and to be a tyrant is futile. Like that always fails. Aristotle says it's short-lived, right? So the ultimate form of power then you see what I'm saying? Like, there's a paradox in it.
You have ultimate power, but you're enslaved to everyone.
But you're totally enslaved. And not only do you, but you don't even, if you're at the guy at the very top, you don't have anyone to complain to about it. Like, you think about, because you have to maintain the fiction all the time. Like, your friends think that you're their friend, but you're not. But you have to fake like you are. The slaves, they at least get to go home to their hovels, right? And complain to each other about the master this. Whoa. They're not faking anything. They're just at the bottom being themselves. They're more free than the guy who has to fake everything at the top all the time. Do you see what I'm like? Yeah. And so that form of so there's so when do you not have that? Well, when you wouldn't have that is when Aristotle talks about perfect kingship, which is what we were talking about basically with the family. The idea would be, if you had a society of virtue, of true virtue, then everybody would recognize the man who is the most outstanding and voluntarily elevate him and voluntarily follow him. not to seek some sort of self-interested advantage, but out of the acknowledgement of the justice of this thing, and that this is the way in which perfection is achieved. And everybody would sort of find their place within the whole without any subordination or exploitation.
Yeah.
Right? And they would pick out the king and make him king, and then they would all fall into place appropriately. But that description is literally couched in explaining why kingship never happens. Right? Because it's
we can only imagine it as
I guess I could imagine that occurring, but he says now kingship never occurs. He says now whatever passes for kingship is really just tyranny, masquerading as kingship.
Plato says the same in
right.
that regard.
So the possibility of it is to demonstrate the absurdity of it.
Yes.
Which means that the guys who are ruling are, like I'm saying, are really, in these imperfect regimes, are really the most conformist and the most servile of the bunch. Or at least that's possible. You know?
And that seems to be the, again, this theme of tragedy or the traps and the circles and that even imagining the master being enslaved and having to wear masks all the way up and not really having much friendship, not real friendship, because he has to, the true statesman has to put on the act that this is all for the benefit of the other. Maybe we could, with Christianity, that like the message of the gospel is that the one who is the true philosopher, the true statesman, God himself, came in the form of a slave. And just how revolutionary an idea of that would be, that the whole problem is, right, the master's enslaved to the slaving mechanism. He's wearing masks for everyone else to have the appearance of being friends, and it all seems to be serving the top. But when we have Christ coming in the form of a slave, it is, and that he is the king who takes the lowest position in the city and goes through all of that just inverts the whole structure. Like when Christ is saying to the apostles, I no longer call you slaves but friends, and he says the least among you is going to be the greatest. That is specifically overturning that whole dynamic of master-slave relationship.
That's right.
That is the ultimate overturning, where power, for Christianity, power actually can be certainly for the benefit of those lower than you. There's still sin. There's still problems there.
Yeah. I think that the key here, and the reason why that's not just a sort of rhetorical trick, right? Is because of the belief that contact with that king. I mean, the reason why he when he becomes a slave, one of the points there is that he goes all the way to the bottom. That it's not mediated through merely human convention. Right, like now human convention is going to be itself constituted or built by people who are operating with one foot outside of the human. Do you see what I'm like? Now the whole social structure has a dimension added to it that is absent for the pagans, which is the dimension of supernature, the dimension of grace, the dimension
the actual
of revelation,
vertical,
the movement of prayer, of liturgy, of sacrament, where now it's not merely a process of sort of education top down and formation of social formation of power structures, which is sort of what we're getting here with Plato and Aristotle, but now that whole process, which is happening, is now cut through at every level with this sort of kingship of an authority that is outside that process. Do you see what I'm trying to say? Like, and therefore capable of judging it. So it becomes conceivable, say, that the servant judges his master, right? Because he now has contact with that which is transcendent of the whole. Right, in Christianity, so and not just in his intellect, but in his will. So both revelation and grace,
right, and at every level.
At every level. So the entire social that's the point, is that it's not merely some sort of intervention from above or some sort of like higher power or something. Yeah. The entire social project or problem, the whole social structure now has a dimension, a direction to it that just was absent in the pagan way of thinking.
They couldn't even imagine that type of intervention.
No.
That it would reach each level, right?
Every
like
level,
you could imagine
right.
the philosopher escaping the cave and going and seeing the light,
and
then ordering downwards.
Right.
But the idea that God himself will take the form of a slave and then suffer and die, and that the gospel is to spread to all men, slave and free, that it's to spread to, it's like Paul preaching to the kings and then eventually going before Caesar, but also preaching to everyone he can,
right.
Going to the Areopagus. He says, Paul says, I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, and to the wise and to the foolish, right? Like because it's a message for all and not just the particular class, it can transect or just cut through all of them to the idea of you actually being a new creation in Christ that is beyond the structured class that you've been sorted into by above.
Right, exactly. And the human end, because the telos of humanity becomes, the beatific vision becomes not an earthly end, but a supernatural end, right? It becomes achievable not only by this select group of the perfect, for whom all the rest of humanity then must be understood as being ordered towards their perfection, which is the pagan,
Yeah, right.
But now that perfection becomes, or that end becomes achievable to the whole, to every, and when I say to the whole, I mean to every individual person. And so then the sociality or the community, the communion of humanity, the political nature of us is no longer this sort of corporate understanding like we're hands and feet and things that are useful to the head, which is the superior. But now we become instead not that kind of corporate entity, but rather a communion of persons, which is a different thing. And sometimes we still use the corporate analogy and stuff, but it can be really misleading.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're not talking about parts to a whole. You're talking about a communion of persons. And because every person is ordered to the end of man, every person is a whole and of himself. And so he's both a part and a whole simultaneously. This is a revolutionary move, an understanding of how human society functions.
Yeah.
Right.
And you can think of it liturgically, right? Like what we're seeing here is almost a political order around an idolatrous pagan god king, right? Like what we're describing is this problem of the central idol that orders all of the priestly class, as we've both encountered in Aristotle and in Plato here, that orders the whole of the society around the conformity to the worship of the idol. It's burn incense to Caesar. It's some type of central figure that does it. But with the liturgia or the people's work or this movement towards the vertical, it's that it reminds of Malachi when he says, from the rising of the sun to the setting, my name is great among the nations, that the prophecy is that in every land and in every particular class that they can become priest, prophet, and king through Christ in their difference and be unified through being the new creation in Christ. And that cuts through all of the lines and doesn't require the conformity to the idol, basically. It's actually a freedom of the sons of God to worship
but none of that, I mean, that's absolutely correct, but none of that challenges, none of that it becomes some sort of denial of human differences, of human authority, of human dependencies, of relative power differentials. What ends up happening is all of those things come into the understanding of how the church, how the ecclesial community achieves the perfection that it's capable of achieving. Right. But none of that is disputed or denied or whitewashed away, which is so much of what Christianity will be accused of, is some sort of like lowering of everything to the level of the slave, or some sort of like egalitarian nonsense or something. And it's like, but that's not the understanding at all. That's the understanding of certain liberal theologians in the modern period, sure, but that's certainly not what we're getting at here.
No, yeah,
no. In fact, all the insights that Aristotle gives us about hierarchy and power, I think, are always relevant to understanding now that the new form, the New Testament has arrived. How is it the humanity that Aristotle so brilliantly describes, how is it that is the humanity that's now elevated, not some other humanity, that humanity?
That is the same humanity that has its errors corrected and is elevated in grace, right? Like there has to be something there that's elevated. And so we can distinguish that there's problems or there's circles or there's things that he can't get out of, and certain moves of natural slaves, of the masks upon masks, that you don't know true friends, that those are the things that because of Christianity and the church, those are taken in a completely different direction. There's ways out of those problems and ways of what is good and human that's there to be elevated.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about St. Thomas, we'll be able to really explore a lot of those things in depth.
Yeah, and I'm pretty excited and go from there. Yeah. Well, this is great. Yeah. So we'll. I think we'll probably just move straight to Aquinas. Maybe we could go back to elements in Aristotle.
Yeah,
I know. We went through a lot. Hopefully, this is helpful to people in seeing what we're doing as a whole. And so next time, Aquinas, Treatise on Law.
Yeah, let's do it.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all for watching and listening, and I will see you in the next one.